Hello and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. She never believed in ghosts until the night her husband kissed her goodbye and walked through a wall. Emma had been married for 3 weeks when it happened, standing in their small Seoul apartment, watching him fade like morning mist through solid concrete. Her scream echoed in the empty room, but no one came, no one heard, and when she pressed her palm against the wall, it was cold enough to burn her skin. The wedding certificate still hung above their bed, both signatures visible in dark ink. But something was wrong with the date, she realized now. Something she had overlooked in her happiness. The numbers seemed to shift when she looked away, rearranging themselves into a year that made no sense, a year that had already passed. Emma had arrived in Seoul 18 months earlier with a contract to teach English at a private academy in Gyeongnam. She was 29, recently divorced, and desperate for a fresh start somewhere far from her old life in Amsterdam. The city overwhelmed her at first, with its neon brilliance and constant motion, but she learned to find quiet spaces in the chaos. She started hiking alone on weekends, taking the subway to the edges of the city where mountains rose like ancient guardians. Gwanak Mountain became her refuge, its trails winding through pine forests that smelled like rain even on clear days. She went there every Saturday morning, climbing until her legs ached, and the city became a distant hum below. It was on one of these hikes, in late autumn, when the leaves were turning copper and gold, that she first saw him. He was sitting on a flat rock near the summit, looking out over the sprawling city with an expression of profound stillness. He wore simple hiking clothes, a dark jacket and worn boots, and his face had a gentle quality that made her feel safe before they even spoke. When he noticed her, he smiled, not the aggressive friendliness of someone looking to intrude, but a quiet acknowledgement of shared space. They sat in silence for nearly 20 minutes before he asked, in careful English, if she was enjoying Korea. His name was Jae-min, he told her, and he came to this spot often to think. She learned he worked in a small bookstore in Gyeongju, that he loved old poetry, and that he had grown up in the neighborhoods at the mountain's base. Over the following months, their meetings became routine. Every Saturday she would find him at the same spot, and they would talk for hours about everything and nothing. He never asked for her phone number, never suggested meeting elsewhere, and she found this strangeness romantic rather than suspicious. The mountain was their place, he said once, and some things should remain sacred. By spring, she realized she was in love with him. Jaemin had a way of listening that made her feel understood in a manner her ex-husband never had. He spoke about beauty and sadness, as if they were the same thing, quoting lines from poets she had never heard of, his voice soft and measured. When she finally kissed him in May, under the shade of a pine tree near their usual spot, he kissed her back with a tenderness that made her cry. They began meeting more frequently, though always on the mountain, always in daylight. He explained that his work schedule was unpredictable, that he lived simply and preferred nature to the noise of restaurants and bars. She accepted this without question, grateful just to be near him. When he proposed in July, it was without a ring, just a quiet question asked at sunset with the city glowing below them. He wanted to marry her in a traditional way, he said, at a small shrine deeper in the mountain, a place his family had used for generations. She agreed immediately, thrilled by the intimacy and uniqueness of it. The ceremony was arranged for late August, and he asked her not to tell anyone yet, explaining that his family was private and preferred these matters handled discreetly. She thought it strange but charming, another piece of the gentle mystery that was Jaemin. On the day of the wedding, she wore a simple white dress and climbed the mountain alone, following his directions to a shrine she had never noticed before, hidden behind a wall of trees and accessible only by a narrow, overgrown path. The shrine was small and old, its wooden beams dark with age, paper lanterns hanging from the eaves, though no one had lit them. Jaemin was waiting inside, dressed in traditional hanbok, and beside him stood an elderly man who performed the ceremony in Korean, his voice like wind through dry leaves. There were no other guests, no witnesses, just the three of them and the mountain's silence. When the old man pronounced them married, Jaemin took her hands, his skin so cold she thought he must be nervous, and kissed her forehead. The certificate they signed was yellowed and smelled faintly of earth, but she signed it anyway, her happiness eclipsing her questions. They descended the mountain together as the sun set, and she felt a completeness she had never known. But when they reached the base, Jaemin stopped at the edge of the trailhead and told her he needed to return to the shrine to retrieve something he had forgotten. He would meet her at her apartment later, he promised, and kissed her once more, before turning back up the path. She watched him disappear into the trees, a strange unease settling in her chest, but she pushed it away and took the subway home. That night, she waited for him, but he never came. She tried calling the bookstore where he said he worked, but the owner, an elderly woman, told her no one named Jaemin had ever been employed there. Confused and increasingly worried, Emma returned to Gwanak Mountain the next morning, retracing her steps to the shrine. The path seemed different in daylight, harder to find, as if the mountain itself was resisting her. When she finally reached the shrine, it was not as she remembered. The structure was collapsing, its roof caved in and covered in moss, the lanterns rotted and hanging by threads. Inside, she found their marriage certificate, but it was torn in half, the edges blackened as if burned. Her wedding ring, which she had placed on the small altar during the ceremony, was embedded in a pool of dried blood that had seeped into the wooden floor. She stumbled backward, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing, and that was when she heard footsteps behind her. She turned, and there was Jaemin, standing in the doorway, wearing the same hanbok from the wedding. But now she could see it was torn and stained, his face pale in a way that seemed wrong, his eyes too dark and too deep. He smiled at her, the same gentle smile, but there was no warmth in it now. Emma wanted to run, but her legs would not obey, and he stepped closer, his movements too smooth, as if he were gliding rather than walking. He told her, in that same soft voice she had loved, that he was sorry. He had not meant to deceive her, he said, but when she first saw him on the mountain, he had been so lonely, and her presence had felt like light in a long darkness. She did not understand, could not make sense of his words, and she demanded to know what was happening, why the shrine was ruined, why there was blood. He reached out and took her hand, his skin now so cold it felt like ice burning, and he explained that he had died 3 years ago. He had come to this mountain to propose to his girlfriend, carrying a ring and a hope that had consumed him for months. But she had refused, gently and with tears, telling him she loved someone else. The pain had been unbearable, and he had climbed higher, past the trails, past the safety markers, seeking solitude in his despair. He had slipped on loose rocks near the summit and fallen, his body found days later by hikers, broken and alone. He did not know why he had remained, why his spirit had lingered when others moved on, but the mountain had kept him, bound to the place of his sorrow. When Emma appeared, so full of life and kindness, he had wanted desperately to feel human again, to experience love without the shadow of rejection. The wedding was real to him, he insisted. even if it was conducted by something that should not exist, even if the shrine was a memory from another time. But the mountain did not forgive lies, he said, and now the bond they had created carried a price. Emma tore her hand away, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and she demanded to know what he meant. Jaemin's expression shifted, a sadness so profound it seemed to age him centuries. He told her that by marrying him, she had tied herself to the mountain, to him, and to the space between life and death. The ceremony was binding in ways she could not understand, conducted in a place where the boundaries were thin and the rules different. He had not known this would happen, he swore, but the mountain had taken her vow and twisted it into something else. She was not dead, not yet, but she was no longer entirely alive either. She would feel it soon, he said. The cold that never left, the way food would lose its taste, the manner in which mirrors would begin to show something wrong with her reflection. She screamed at him that this could not be real, that she would leave, go back to her life, forget this nightmare. But even as she spoke, she felt it, the creeping chill in her bones, the way the sunlight filtering through the broken roof seemed dimmer, as if the world itself was pulling away from her. Jaemin stepped aside, letting her pass, and she ran from the shrine, crashing through the forest, her dress tearing on branches. She ran until she collapsed on the main trail, gasping and sobbing, and other hikers found her there, asking if she was hurt. She tried to explain, but the words came out confused and frantic, and they looked at her with concern and pity, guiding her down the mountain as if she were ill. When she reached home, she locked herself in her apartment and scrubbed her hands until they bled, trying to wash away the cold, but it remained, sinking deeper. Over the following days, everything Jaemin had said began to manifest. Food tasted like ash. Her body felt distant and numb, and when she looked in mirrors, there was a flicker, just for a moment, of something standing behind her that should not be there. She tried to seek help, visiting a hospital, but the doctors found nothing wrong, suggesting stress and trauma. She went to a temple, speaking to a monk who listened with a grave expression, and then told her that some bonds cannot be undone by the living, that she had entered into a contract with forces that did not care for human regret. He offered prayers, but warned her that she had already crossed a threshold. Emma became desperate, researching the mountain, the shrine, and finally finding old news articles about a man named Park Jae-min who had died in a hiking accident 3 years prior. His photograph stared at her from the screen, the same face, the same gentle eyes, and she knew with absolute certainty that she had married a ghost. She returned to the mountain one final time, climbing to the shrine in daylight with a strange calm. Jaemin was there, as she knew he would be, sitting on the steps of the ruined structure. She sat beside him, the cold no longer frightening her, and asked him if there was a way to undo this. He shook his head slowly, his eyes filled with sorrow, and told her that the mountain had claimed her the moment she said her vows, but he offered her a choice. She could leave, return to her life, and live with the slow erosion of her humanity, feeling herself fade over years until she was neither here nor there. Or she could stay, accept what she had become, and remain with him in the space between. He loved her, he said, even now, even like this, and he would understand whatever she chose. Emma did not answer right away. She looked out over the city, the place she had come to for a new beginning, and realized that her life had ended the moment she signed that certificate. Her family in Amsterdam would never understand. Her students would forget her, and the world would move on as it always did. She thought about the cold that had settled into her marrow, the way colors were already fading, and she knew that leaving would mean a slow death, haunted and alone. She turned to Jaemin and took his hand, no longer flinching at the cold, because she was just as cold now. She told him she would stay, not because she forgave him, but because there was no other path left. He closed his eyes, a single tear sliding down his pale cheek, and the shrine around them seemed to exhale, the broken beams settling, the air growing heavier. Emma felt herself slip further from the living world, the sounds of the mountain fading into a deep, resonant silence. When hikers found her body 3 days later, seated at the base of an old shrine they swore had not been there before, she looked peaceful, her hands folded in her lap, a faint smile on her lips. The authorities ruled it exposure and exhaustion, another tragic accident on Gwanak Mountain. But those who knew the trails, the old-timers who remembered the stories, whispered that the mountain had taken another bride, and that on certain nights when the moon was full, 2 figures could be seen walking hand in hand near the summit, their forms flickering like candle flames in the wind, bound together in a love that death could not end, but life could never reclaim. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In another part of Korea, in the bustling port city of Busan, something equally disturbing took place. This time, the victim was not a foreigner searching for new beginnings, but a local woman who thought she had found love in the most ordinary of places. Train stations are full of people, thousands passing through every day, and yet it was there, in that crowded, fluorescent-lit space, that she met someone who should not have existed. What happened to her challenges everything we think we know about the living and the dead, about the spaces where they cross paths, and about the terrible price of love that refuses to let go. This is her story. She saw him every evening at exactly 6:15. Minji worked as a receptionist at a hotel near Busan Station, and her shift ended at 6, leaving her just enough time to catch the 6:30 train to her neighborhood in the northern suburbs. The station was always crowded at that hour, a river of commuters flowing through the gates, but she had learned to navigate it with practiced efficiency. It was on a Tuesday in late September that she first noticed him. He was sitting on one of the metal benches near Platform 3, holding a paper cup of coffee, his posture relaxed, his gaze distant. There was nothing particularly striking about him, just a young man in his late 20s, with a kind face and tired eyes, but something made her look twice. The next evening he was there again, same bench, same coffee, same expression. By the end of the week, she found herself looking for him, a strange comfort in the consistency of his presence. On the 8th day, he looked up as she passed and smiled, a small, genuine curve of his lips, and she smiled back without thinking. The day after that, he spoke, his voice soft and polite, asking if she took this train every evening. She said yes, and he nodded, as if this confirmed something important. His name was Hyun-woo, he told her, and he worked nearby in a small accounting firm. The conversation was brief and inconsequential, but it felt like the beginning of something. Over the following weeks, their nightly exchanges grew longer and more personal. Hyun-woo always arrived before her and waited on the same bench, and she began timing her departure to allow a few extra minutes to talk. He was easy to be around, thoughtful and quiet, with a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard. He asked about her day, remembered small details she mentioned in passing, and never pushed for more than she was willing to share. Min-ji, who had been cautiously single for 2 years after a painful breakup, found herself looking forward to these moments more than anything else in her routine. When he finally asked if she would like to meet for dinner, she agreed without hesitation. They went to a small restaurant near the station, a modest place that served stews and grilled fish, and the evening passed in easy conversation. He was attentive and kind, paying for the meal and walking her to her train afterward, his hand brushing hers, in a way that felt both accidental and intentional. They began seeing each other regularly, always meeting at the station first before going somewhere nearby, and within a month, Minji realized she was falling in love. Hyun-woo had a gentleness that soothed something anxious in her, a way of making her feel seen without being scrutinized. When he told her he loved her, standing on the same platform where they had first spoken, she said it back without hesitation, meaning every word. Their relationship moved quickly after that. Hyun-woo suggested they move in together, explaining that his apartment was small but comfortable, located not far from the station, and that he wanted to wake up beside her every morning. Minji agreed, thrilled and nervous, and within 2 weeks she had packed her belongings and moved into his place. The apartment was modest, a single-bedroom unit on the 4th floor of an older building, sparsely furnished but clean. Hyun-woo had few possessions, which he attributed to a minimalist lifestyle, and Minji appreciated the simplicity. They married in a small civil ceremony a month later, just the two of them and a clerk at the district office, followed by a quiet lunch at the same restaurant where they had their first date. Minji felt happier than she had in years, grateful for the unexpected gift of this gentle, reliable man. But even in those early days of marriage, there were small strangeness she noticed but dismissed. Hyun-woo never ate in front of her, claiming he had a sensitive stomach and preferred to eat alone or very late at night. He never seemed to sleep, always awake when she drifted off, and already awake when she woke, sitting by the window or reading quietly. When she suggested taking photos together, he became uncomfortable, making excuses about disliking cameras, and every attempt to capture their happiness ended with blurred images or technical failures. She laughed it off, blaming her old phone, but a small unease began to settle in the back of her mind. The cold started a week after they married. Minji woke one morning shivering, her breath visible in the air, and she could not understand why. The thermostat showed a normal temperature, but the apartment felt like a freezer, the walls damp with condensation. Hyun-woo seemed unbothered, insisting he felt nothing unusual, and she began to wonder if she was getting sick. The cold persisted, growing worse each day, and she took to wearing layers even indoors, wrapping herself in blankets that did little to help. Hyun-woo watched her with concern, but his touch, when he held her at night, was colder than the air, his skin like marble against hers. She mentioned it once, trying to make a joke, but his expression darkened, and he pulled away, telling her she was imagining things. The strangeness escalated when Minji began to notice other things. Hyun-woo cast no shadow, even in direct light, and his reflection in the bathroom mirror was faint, as if he were standing behind a veil. She told herself it was the lighting, the stress of adjusting to married life, but the explanations felt hollow. One evening, she arrived home early and found the apartment empty. No sign that Hyun-woo had been there at all, despite his insistence that he worked from home most days. When he appeared an hour later, he claimed he had gone out for a walk, but his clothes were dry despite the rain pouring outside. Minji's unease grew into something sharper, a fear she could not name, and she began to watch him more closely, searching for explanations that made sense. It was her friend Soo-jin who finally forced the issue. Soo-jin had been asking to meet Hyun-woo for weeks, curious about the man Minji had married so quickly, and Minji had run out of excuses. She invited Soo-jin over for dinner, insisting to Hyun-woo that it was important. He agreed reluctantly, but when the evening came, he barely spoke, sitting at the table with a strained smile, his presence oddly muted. Soo-jin, always perceptive, seemed uncomfortable, her eyes darting between Minji and Hyunwoo with barely concealed confusion. When she pulled Minji aside to help in the kitchen, she asked quietly if everything was okay, if Minji was safe. The question startled Minji, and she asked what Sujin meant. Her friend hesitated, then admitted that something felt wrong, that Hyunwoo seemed strange, almost not there. Minji defended him, but Sujin's words lodged themselves in her mind like splinters. After Sujin left, Hyunwoo became withdrawn, barely speaking, and that night the apartment felt colder than ever, the air thick and oppressive. Minji lay awake, listening to the silence, and realized she could not hear Hyunwoo breathing beside her. She reached out in the darkness, her hand finding his shoulder, and the cold was so intense it burned her palm. She jerked back, her heart pounding, and when she turned on the light, he was staring at the ceiling, his eyes open but unseeing, his face pale and slack. She whispered his name, and slowly, too slowly, he turned his head to look at her, and for just a moment, his eyes were black, empty voids that reflected nothing. The next morning, Minji went to the building's security office and asked to see the CCTV footage from the past month. She needed to confirm something, she told the guard, a package delivery issue, and he allowed her to review the recordings. What she saw made her blood turn to ice. The footage showed her entering and leaving the building, always alone. She watched herself on the day she moved in, carrying boxes by herself, speaking to empty air. She saw herself returning from work, stopping in the lobby to talk to no one, laughing at jokes that no one had told. In every frame she was alone, always alone, and there was no Hyunwoo, no figure beside her, just empty space where he should have been. She went back further, to the evenings at Busan station, and found herself sitting on benches, holding one-sided conversations, smiling at nothing. The guard asked if she was all right, his voice filled with concern, and she stumbled out of the office, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she had seen. She returned to the apartment in a daze, and Hyunwoo was there, waiting, his expression knowing and sad. She confronted him, her voice shaking, demanding to know what he was, why the cameras did not see him. He stood slowly, and for the first time, he did not try to deflect or soothe her fears. He told her the truth, his voice steady and resigned. He was not alive, not in the way she understood, and he had not been for a very long time. He had died at Busan station 5 years earlier, a sudden heart attack on platform 3, his body collapsing on a metal bench while commuters rushed past, too hurried to notice until it was far too late. He did not know why he had remained, why his spirit had lingered in the place of his death, but he had been trapped there, watching the living pass by, unseen and unheard. When Minji first smiled at him, something changed, a connection that should not have been possible, and he realized she could see him, perceive him in a way no one else could. He had not meant to deceive her, he insisted, but the loneliness had been unbearable, and her attention had felt like salvation. He had convinced himself it could work, that love was enough to bridge the gap between life and death, and for a while it had seemed possible. But the truth could not be hidden forever, and now she knew. He told her that by marrying him, by inviting him into her life so completely, she had bound herself to him in ways that could not be easily undone. The cold she felt was his presence, the space he occupied pushing against the warmth of the living world, and it would only grow worse. He loved her, he said, truly and desperately, but he understood if she could not accept what he was. Minji backed away from him, her mind screaming, and she told him she needed to leave, to get away and think. He did not stop her, and she ran from the apartment, not knowing where to go. She wandered the streets of Busan for hours, the city blurring around her, until she found herself back at the station, standing on platform 3 where they had met. The bench was still there, unremarkable and cold, and she sat down, trying to make sense of the impossible. She thought about the footage, the months of living with a ghost, the way her life had been invaded by something that should not exist. But she also thought about the nights he had held her, the way he had listened, the love that had felt so real. She did not know what to believe anymore, what was truth, and what was her mind breaking under the strain. When she finally returned to the apartment, it was past midnight, and Hyunwoo was waiting by the window, his form almost translucent in the dim light. She asked him what would happen if she stayed, and he told her honestly that she would continue to fade, that his presence would sap the warmth from her life until she existed in the same cold, liminal space he occupied. But if she left, he said, he would disappear, unable to maintain his form without her connection, and he would return to the station, alone again, waiting for nothing. She realized then that she had a choice, but neither option offered escape. She could leave and live, but the knowledge of what she had experienced would haunt her, the cold already in her bones a reminder of the boundary she had crossed. Or she could stay and accept the slow erosion of her humanity, loving a ghost until she became one herself. Minji stood in the center of the apartment, the cold seeping through her skin, and she made her decision. She told Hyunwoo that she could not stay, that she wanted to live, even if it meant living with the memory of him. He nodded, his expression breaking, and he told her he understood. He asked for one last thing, to walk her to the station one final time, and she agreed, unable to deny him this. They left the apartment together, moving through the empty streets, and at the station, he stopped at platform 3, his form flickering like a dying bulb. He told her that the next train did not carry the living, that there were departures meant only for those like him, and that he would take one soon. He leaned in and kissed her forehead, his lips so cold they left a mark like frostbite, and he whispered that he was sorry. Minji watched as he walked onto the platform, and a train arrived, its windows dark, its interior empty, and he stepped aboard without looking back. The doors closed, and the train pulled away, silent and swift, disappearing into the tunnel. She stood there for a long time, the station empty around her, and when she finally left, the cold began to fade, slowly, as if reluctant to let her go. She moved out of the apartment the next day, finding a new place far from the station, and she tried to rebuild her life. But sometimes, late at night, she felt the cold return, a phantom touch on her skin, and she wondered if Hyunwoo was still out there, waiting on platform 3, hoping she might change her mind. And on certain evenings, when the station was quiet and the light was dim, commuters reported seeing a young woman sitting alone, speaking softly to empty air, her breath visible in the cold, her eyes fixed on a train that never came. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to an even darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying, where the boundaries between reality and nightmare collapse entirely. In the stories ahead, we will encounter places where the dead do not simply linger but actively reach out, pulling the living into their world with a hunger that cannot be satisfied. These are tales of possession, of spaces that remember violence, and of people who thought they could escape the past only to discover that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. What happened to these individuals will make you question every shadow, every unexplained sound, and every moment you feel watched when you know you are alone. She returned to her hotel room to find wet footprints leading from the door to her bed, each step perfectly formed, trailing seawater and bits of dark sand. Ji-won stood frozen in the doorway, her suitcase slipping from her hand. Because she had locked that door, she was certain of it, and the only key was in her purse. The footprints were too large to be hers, too deep, as if whoever made them carried an impossible weight. She followed them with her eyes, watching them circle the bed once, twice, 3 times, before stopping at the side where she slept. The sheets were damp, soaked through in the shape of a body, and when she touched them, her fingers came away cold and smelling of salt and decay. On the pillow lay her wedding ring, the one she had thrown into the ocean that morning, in a desperate attempt to sever whatever bond had formed. It gleamed in the dim light, perfectly dry, and when she picked it up, she felt it pulse like a heartbeat against her palm. Ji-won had come to Jeju Island 3 months earlier for a photography assignment, hired by a travel magazine, to capture the island's volcanic landscapes and coastal beauty. She was 31, a freelance photographer based in Busan, and she welcomed the escape from her cluttered apartment and the monotony of commercial shoots. Jeju was stunning in early summer, its green hills rolling down to black sand beaches, the extinct volcano Halasan rising in the center like a sleeping giant. She spent her first week exploring alone, hiking the Ali trails and photographing the stone harabang statues that guarded the island's villages. It was during one of these hikes, along the coastal path near Seongsan Ilchulbong, that she met Tae-hyun. He was leading a small tour group, explaining the geological history of the tuff cone in fluent English and Korean, his voice warm and engaging. He noticed her camera and complimented her lens choice, and they fell into easy conversation after his group dispersed. He was a local, born and raised in a fishing village on the eastern coast, and he had been working as a tour guide for 5 years. There was something magnetic about him, a quiet confidence and deep knowledge of the island that Ji-won found captivating. When he offered to show her hidden locations not listed in any guidebook, she accepted without hesitation. Over the next 2 weeks, they spent nearly every day together. Tae-hyun took her to secret beaches, accessible only at low tide, to lava tubes that descended into the earth like veins, and to small shrines tucked away in forests where shamans once performed rituals. He told her stories about the island's history, about the Haenyeo divers who harvested the sea, and about the myths of dragons and spirits that still shaped local beliefs. Ji-won photographed everything, but she found herself increasingly focused on him, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair, the easy grace of his movements. They had dinner together most evenings, at small restaurants where he knew the owners, and she felt herself falling for him in a way that surprised her with its intensity. Tae-hyun seemed equally drawn to her, his attention focused and sincere, and when he kissed her for the first time, under a canopy of stars at Manjangul Cave, she felt a certainty she had never experienced before. He proposed a month into their relationship, during a sunset at Udo Island, presenting a simple silver ring and asking her to stay, to make Jeju her home. Ji-won said yes, overwhelmed by the romance of it all, and they married quickly in a small ceremony at a seaside shrine, just the two of them and an elderly officiant who spoke in dialect she barely understood. Tae-hyun insisted on keeping the wedding intimate, explaining that his family was traditional and preferred privacy in such matters. She found it unusual but endearing, another charming quirk of island life. The first sign that something was wrong came the day after the wedding, when Ji-won went into the village to buy groceries. She mentioned Tae-hyun's name to the shopkeeper, an older woman with weathered hands, and the woman's face went pale. She asked Ji-won to repeat the name, and when she did, the shopkeeper stepped back, making a warning gesture with her fingers. She told Ji-won in halting English that there was no one by that name in the village, not anymore, and that she should leave, go back to the mainland, and forget whatever she thought she knew. Ji-won, confused and upset, pressed for details, but the woman refused to say more, practically shooing her out of the shop. Similar reactions followed whenever she mentioned her husband. People avoided eye contact, changed the subject, or walked away quickly, their faces filled with fear or pity. An elderly fisherman finally pulled her aside near the docks and told her quietly that Park Tae-hyun had drowned 7 years ago, his body found wedged in the rocks of a lava tube after a diving accident. The whole village had mourned, the fisherman said, because Tae-hyun had been a good man, kind and knowledgeable, someone everyone liked. Ji-won insisted there was a mistake, that her husband was very much alive, but the fisherman just shook his head sadly and walked away, leaving her standing alone on the pier. She tried to dismiss it as a case of mistaken identity, perhaps another man with the same name, but the seed of doubt had been planted, and it grew rapidly. That evening, she confronted Tae-hyun in their rented cottage near the coast. She asked him directly about what the villagers had said, and his expression shifted, becoming guarded in a way she had never seen. He told her the villagers were superstitious, that they disliked outsiders marrying locals, and that they were trying to scare her away. He insisted he was real, standing right in front of her, and that she should trust what she could see and touch rather than gossip. She wanted to believe him, but the conviction in his voice felt rehearsed, and when she reached for his hand, his skin was cold, colder than the night air warranted. She pulled away, a chill running through her, and he noticed, his eyes darkening with something like sadness. He told her he loved her, that everything would make sense soon, and that she needed to have faith. But that night, as she lay beside him, she could not shake the feeling that she was sleeping next to something that only resembled a man, something that wore his face but lacked the warmth of life. She barely slept, listening to the sound of waves crashing outside, and when dawn came, she found Tae-hyun gone. No note, no explanation. Ji-won spent the morning searching for answers. She went to the local library, a small building near the town center, and asked to see old newspapers. The librarian, a young woman who seemed nervous, helped her find the archives from 7 years prior. The article was there, dated August 12th, detailing the tragic death of Park Tae-hyun, age 25, a beloved tour guide who had drowned while exploring Manjang Cave. His body had been recovered 3 days later, trapped in a flooded section of the lava tube, and the funeral had drawn mourners from across the island. There was a photograph accompanying the article, grainy but unmistakable. It was him, the same face, the same gentle eyes, the man she had married. Ji-won's hands trembled as she read, her mind struggling to reconcile the impossible. The librarian watched her with a mixture of sympathy and fear, and when Ji-won asked where Tae-hyun was buried, the woman hesitated before giving directions to a small cemetery on the island's eastern edge. Ji-won drove there in a daze, her rental car navigating narrow roads lined with stone walls, and when she found the grave, it was well maintained, flowers still fresh in their holders. The headstone bore his name, his dates, and a simple inscription about the sea claiming its own. She knelt there for over an hour, tears streaming down her face, trying to understand how she had fallen in love with a ghost, how she had married someone who was not even alive. When she returned to the cottage, Tae-hyun was waiting inside, sitting by the window with that same calm expression. She demanded the truth, her voice breaking, and he finally relented. He told her he did not fully understand what he was, only that he had remained on the island after his death, bound to the places he had loved and the work he had devoted himself to. He had been alone for years, invisible to most, until she arrived with her camera and her openness. And for reasons he could not explain, she had been able to see him, to interact with him as if he were alive. He had not meant to deceive her, he said, but the loneliness had been unbearable, and when she responded to him, it felt like a miracle. The wedding had been real to him, a binding of spirits that he believed could transcend death, and he loved her truly, even if his love came from a place beyond the living. Ji-won listened, her heart breaking, and she told him she could not stay, that she needed to leave the island and return to her life. He did not argue, but his expression was one of deep sorrow, and he warned her that leaving might not be as simple as she hoped. She ignored the warning, packing her belongings in a frenzy, and booked a ferry for the next morning. But that night, the footprints appeared, and the ring returned, and she understood that the island was not going to let her go. Her attempts to leave became increasingly desperate and futile. The next morning, the ferry was cancelled due to unexpected rough seas, despite clear skies. Her phone lost signal, unable to make calls or send messages, and when she tried using the hotel's landline, the line was filled with static and a voice that sounded like Tae-hyun whispering her name. She tried to drive to the airport, but the roads looped back on themselves, returning her to the cottage no matter which direction she took. Other guests at the hotel began to avoid her, sensing something wrong, and the staff looked at her with thinly veiled pity. At night, she heard footsteps circling her bed, wet and heavy, the sound of water dripping onto the floor. She tried sleeping with the lights on, but it made no difference. The presence was there, patient and relentless, and she could feel Tae-hyun's sadness pressing against her like a physical weight. On the third night, she woke to find him standing at the foot of her bed, his clothes soaked, his hair dripping seawater, his skin pale and tinged with blue. He told her he was sorry, that he had bound her to the island through the wedding, and that the island itself had accepted their union, making it impossible for her to leave without his permission. He loved her, he said again, and he wanted her to stay, to be with him in the space between life and death, where time moved differently and loneliness could be held at bay. Ji-won screamed at him, called him selfish and cruel, and tried to run, but the door would not open, the windows would not break. She collapsed on the floor, sobbing, and Tae-hyun knelt beside her, his cold hand touching her shoulder. He told her he would release her, that he could not keep her against her will, but that it would require a choice. She could leave, return to the mainland, and live her life, but she would carry a piece of the island with her, a cold that would never leave, a sense of being watched that would follow her until her death. Or she could stay, accept what he was, and exist in the twilight space he occupied, neither fully alive nor fully dead, but together. Ji-won looked at him through her tears, at the man she had loved who was no longer a man, and she made her decision. She told him she would rather live with the cold than lose herself entirely, and she begged him to let her go. His face crumpled with grief, but he nodded, and he told her to return to the shrine where they had married. There, he said, she could undo the bond, but it would cost her something she could not yet understand. She went to the shrine the next morning, a small structure perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Tae-hyun was there, as he said he would be, standing among the stone markers and faded offerings. He instructed her to remove the ring and throw it into the sea, to speak aloud her wish to be released, and to never speak his name again. She did as he asked, her hands shaking, and as the ring arced through the air and disappeared into the waves, she felt something inside her snap, a connection severed. Tae-hyun's form flickered, becoming translucent, and he told her she was free now, that the island would let her leave. But his final words were a warning, that some bonds once formed left scars that never fully healed, and that she would always carry a part of him with her. He faded then, dissolving into the sea mist, and Jiwon was alone on the cliff, the wind biting at her skin. She left Jeju that afternoon, the ferry departing without incident, and she returned to Busan, to her apartment and her work, trying to rebuild the life she had left behind. But the cold remained, a persistent chill in her bones that no amount of heat could dispel, and at night she heard the ocean in her dreams, waves whispering her married name, a name she had sworn never to speak again. She never returned to Jeju, never spoke of what happened, but sometimes, when the wind was strong and the night was dark, she felt wet footprints on the floor beside her bed, circling slowly, waiting. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as chilling as that story was, it is far from the only one. In the sprawling urban maze of Seoul, where millions of lives intersect every day, another woman discovered that love can arrive from places that should not exist. What happened to her began on a night when the city went dark, and in that darkness, something that should have remained hidden stepped forward into her life. This is a story about trust, about the way we accept what we see without questioning what lies beneath, and about the terrible moment when reality fractures and the truth emerges, cold and unforgiving. The first time Hae-jin saw him, Seoul was drowning in darkness. It was a Tuesday evening in late October when the power grid failed across 3 districts, plunging neighborhoods into an unexpected blackout that would last for hours. Hae-jin had been walking home from her job at a publishing house in Gangnam when the lights went out, the sudden absence of illumination turning familiar streets into alien landscapes. She stood on the sidewalk, disoriented, as car headlights swept past and people around her pulled out phones, their screens glowing like fireflies. She fumbled for her own phone, but the battery was dead, a consequence of too many idle hours scrolling during a slow workday. A voice beside her asked if she needed help, soft and polite, and she turned to see a man standing close, his face barely visible in the dim light from a distant storefront. He offered her his phone to call someone, and she declined politely, explaining that she lived nearby and could manage. He insisted on walking with her, saying the streets were unsafe in the dark, and she accepted, grateful for the company. His name was Min-seok, he told her as they walked, and he worked in IT, though he was vague about the details. They talked easily, their conversation flowing despite the circumstances, and when they reached her apartment building, she found herself reluctant to say goodbye. He asked if he could see her again, and she gave him her number, surprised by her own boldness. They began dating within a week, meeting for coffee and dinners, their relationship developing with a speed that felt both exhilarating and natural. Min-seok was unlike anyone Hae-jin had dated before, quiet but attentive, thoughtful in ways that caught her off guard. He listened when she talked about her work, her frustrations with her demanding editor, her dreams of one day writing her own book, and he offered insights that were perceptive without being intrusive. He had a way of making her feel seen, understood in a manner that was rare and precious. But even in those early days, there were small details that nagged at her. Min-seok never seemed to eat much, picking at his food during meals and claiming a sensitive stomach. He avoided bright lights, preferring dimly lit restaurants and evening walks, and he always wore long sleeves, even as autumn gave way to winter. When she suggested meeting his friends or family, he deflected, saying he was private and preferred keeping their relationship separate from other parts of his life. Hae-jin found it strange but not alarming, attributing it to personality quirks or past hurts she had not yet learned about. She was falling in love, and she chose to focus on what felt right rather than what felt off. They married 4 months after meeting, a decision that shocked Haejin's friends and family, but felt inevitable to her. Min-sok had proposed during a late-night walk along the Han River, the city lights reflecting on the water, and she had said yes without hesitation. The wedding was small, held at a district office with 2 witnesses pulled from the waiting room, and they moved into her apartment afterward, Min-sok bringing only a single suitcase of belongings. He explained that he had been living in temporary housing, that he preferred minimalism, and Haejin accepted this without pressing further. But living together revealed more strangeness. Min-sok never seemed to sleep, always awake when she went to bed, and already awake when she woke, claiming insomnia and a preference for working at night. She never saw him eat a full meal, and the groceries she bought remained mostly untouched. He avoided mirrors, turning away whenever they passed one, and when she tried to take a photo of them together, his image appeared blurred or absent, as if the camera could not properly focus on him. She mentioned these oddities once, trying to make light of them, but his reaction was sharp and defensive, and she dropped the subject, unwilling to risk their fragile happiness. The real unraveling began when Haejin noticed that Min-sok's breath never fogged in the cold. It was a bitter December morning, and they were walking to the subway together, their breath visible in the freezing air, or at least hers was. She watched him speak, his words clear and steady, but no vapor emerged from his mouth, no sign of warmth meeting cold. She stopped walking, staring at him, and he noticed, his expression shifting to something guarded. She asked him why, and he claimed he had just exhaled, that she had missed it, but she knew what she had seen. That same week, she began noticing other things. Animals reacted strangely to him, dogs pulling away on their leashes when he passed, cats hissing and retreating. A bird flew into their apartment window while he was standing near it, the impact so violent it left a crack in the glass and a smear of blood and feathers. Min-sok cleaned it up without comment, but Haejin felt a growing unease she could no longer ignore. She started paying closer attention, watching him when he thought she was not looking, and the more she watched, the more she saw. His skin had a faint translucence in certain lights. His shadow seemed too faint, and there were moments when his eyes looked through her rather than at her, as if he were seeing something else entirely. It was her co-worker Ji-woo who provided the catalyst for confrontation. Ji-woo had been asking about Min-sok for weeks, curious about the whirlwind marriage, and Haejin had finally agreed to share his contact information so Ji-woo could add him to a group chat for a company gathering. But when Ji-woo tried calling the number Min-sok had given Haejin, it did not connect, the line dead. Ji-woo mentioned this casually over lunch, and Haejin felt her stomach drop. That evening, she asked Min-sok for his address from before they moved in together, claiming she needed it for some paperwork. He hesitated, then gave her an address in Noongu, a neighborhood in northern Seoul. The next day, Haejin called in sick to work and took the subway to that address, her heart pounding with dread and determination. The building was an older apartment complex, and she found the unit number Min-sok had given her on the 4th floor. She knocked, and an elderly woman answered, her face kind and lined with age. Haejin explained that she was looking for Min-sok, and the woman's expression changed, her eyes filling with tears. She asked Haejin to repeat the name, and when she did, the woman began to sob, stepping back and inviting Haejin inside with trembling hands. The apartment was a shrine to a dead son. Photographs covered the walls, showing a young man who was unmistakably Min-sok, smiling in family portraits, graduation photos, casual snapshots. The woman, Min-sok's mother, told Haejin through her tears that her son had died 2 years ago, killed in a car accident on a rainy night in October. He had been driving home from work when another vehicle ran a red light, the collision instant and fatal. She had lost her only child, and the grief had nearly destroyed her. She asked Haejin why she was asking about him, and Haejin, her voice shaking, explained that she had married someone who looked exactly like the man in the photos, someone who had given this address. The mother's face went white, and she grabbed Haejin's arm, asking when they met. Haejin told her, October of this year, during the blackout. The mother's grip tightened, and she whispered that the blackout had been on the anniversary of her son's death, the exact date and time he had died. She begged Haejin to leave, to stay away from whatever was pretending to be her son, and she pressed a photograph into Haejin's hand, a picture of Min-sok's funeral, his coffin surrounded by flowers. Haejin left the apartment in a state of shock, the photograph burning in her pocket. She wandered the streets for hours, unable to process what she had learned, until finally she forced herself to return home. It was late evening when she unlocked her apartment door, the interior dark and silent. She turned on the lights, and Min-sok was sitting on the couch, waiting, his expression calm and knowing. She stood in the doorway, unable to move, and he smiled, that gentle smile she had loved, and asked her how her visit had gone. She demanded to know what he was, her voice cracking, and he tilted his head, the smile fading. He told her he was her husband, that he loved her, and that the details of his existence were complicated but ultimately unimportant. She pulled out the photograph, holding it up, and asked him to explain the funeral, the death, the mother who was still mourning. He looked at the image without expression, then met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something inhuman in his gaze, something cold and vast. He told her the truth, his voice devoid of emotion. He had died, yes, on that rainy October night, his life ending in a moment of metal and glass and pain. But he had not moved on, had not found peace or oblivion, because he had been alone when he died, unloved and unseen, and that loneliness had anchored him to the world. He had lingered, invisible and intangible, watching the living continue without him, until the blackout, a night when the city's light failed and the boundaries between worlds thinned. In that darkness, he had been able to step forward, to take a form that could be seen and touched, and Haejin had been there, vulnerable and kind, and he had chosen her. He had built a life around her, piece by piece, feeding off her belief in him, her love sustaining his presence in a way nothing else could. The marriage had been the final binding, a contract that allowed him to remain, to exist as long as she accepted him. He loved her, he insisted, in the only way something like him could love, and he had given her companionship and affection in return. But now she knew, and the knowing changed everything. Haejin backed toward the door, her mind screaming, but Min-sok stood, moving with a speed and fluidity that was wrong, and he blocked her path. He told her she could not leave, that they were bound now, and that her life was entwined with his in ways she could not escape. She tried to push past him, but his hand caught her wrist, and his grip was freezing, so cold it burned, and she screamed. He released her immediately, his expression pained, and he told her he did not want to hurt her, that he only wanted her to stay, to accept what they had. But Haejin was beyond reason, beyond fear, and she grabbed her phone and keys and ran from the apartment, not looking back. She stayed with Jiwoo that night, sobbing and incoherent, and her friend held her and promised to help. The next day, they went to the apartment together, but when they opened the door, it was empty. Min-sok's belongings were gone, the space scrubbed clean as if he had never existed. Haejin searched frantically, but there was no trace of him, no evidence of their life together except for the photographs on her phone, and even those had changed. In every image, she stood alone, her arms positioned as if holding someone, her smile directed at empty air. She tried to move on, to convince herself it had been a delusion, a breakdown brought on by stress, but the cold remained. She felt it in her apartment, in her bed, a presence that watched and waited. At night, she heard footsteps in the hallway, the sound of keys turning in a lock that no longer fit. She changed the locks, moved to a new apartment, but it made no difference. Min Seok was still there, a shadow in her peripheral vision, a voice in the static of her phone. He never appeared fully again, never spoke, but she knew he was waiting, patient and relentless, for her to accept the bond they had formed. Jin lived in fear, unable to trust her own perception, and she confided in no one, knowing they would think her insane. She learned to exist in the spaces he did not occupy, to avoid darkness, to keep lights on at all hours. But the exhaustion was taking its toll. And on the anniversary of the blackout, 1 year after they had met, she woke to find him standing at the foot of her bed, smiling that gentle smile, asking her why she had visited his funeral without him, asking her if she was ready to come home. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. The last 2 stories we will share today are different. They are quieter, but far more disturbing, the kind that stay with you long after the telling ends, burrowing into your thoughts and refusing to leave. These are not tales of dramatic confrontations or violent hauntings, but of slow realizations, of truths that emerge so gradually you do not notice until it is far too late. They speak to the fear of losing yourself, of discovering that the life you thought you were living was built on foundations that never existed, and of the terrible moment when you realize that the person you loved most was never real at all. What happened to these final victims will make you question every relationship, every promise, and every moment you felt certain of another's presence. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what comes from the dark, but what was hiding in the light all along. She woke to find him kneeling beside the bed, his eyes open and unblinking, staring at her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. Sumin had been married for 2 days, and in that time, she had not seen her husband close his eyes once, not to blink, not to sleep, not even when dust swirled through the air of their borrowed room in the old guest house near the tombs. His gaze was constant and unwavering, like stone carved to imitate sight, and when she asked him about it, he smiled and said he simply enjoyed watching her, that she was too beautiful to look away from. She wanted to believe the compliment, but something in his stillness felt wrong, inhuman, and when she touched his hand to pull him back to bed, his skin was coated in a thin layer of cold mud that smelled of earth and rot, and something far older than memory. Sumin had arrived in Gyeongju 6 weeks earlier, a travel blogger specializing in historical sites and cultural tourism. She was 28, with a modest but loyal following on social media, and she had been planning this trip for months. Gyeongju, the ancient capital of the Silla Kingdom, was a treasure trove of archaeological wonders, from the royal tombs rising like grass-covered mounds across the landscape to the stone observatories and temple ruins that dotted the countryside. She rented a small apartment near the city center and spent her days exploring, photographing everything, writing detailed posts about the history and significance of each site. It was during a visit to Daryungwon, the sprawling complex of burial mounds, that she met Sang-woo. He was standing near one of the larger tombs, a notebook in hand, sketching the contours of the mound with careful precision. When she approached to take a photo, he looked up and apologized for being in her frame, offering to move. They began talking, and she learned he was a historian specializing in the Sia period, working on a personal research project about burial practices and royal succession. His knowledge was extensive and delivered with a quiet passion that Sumin found compelling. He offered to show her sites not typically included in tourist itineraries, places where the history felt more immediate and less curated, and she accepted eagerly. Over the following weeks, Sang-woo became her constant companion. He took her to forgotten tombs on the outskirts of the city, to overgrown paths where ancient stone markers stood half-buried in weeds, and to small museums housed in rural temples where artifacts were displayed without fanfare. He spoke about the past as if he had lived it, describing court intrigues and religious ceremonies with a vividness that made her feel as if she were witnessing history unfold. Sumin documented everything, her blog posts gaining traction as she shared these hidden aspects of Gyeongju, and she credited Sang-woo's expertise in every entry. But she also found herself drawn to him personally, to his gentle demeanor and the way he listened to her thoughts as if they mattered deeply. He was handsome in an understated way, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to hold centuries of knowledge. And when he finally kissed her one evening as the sun set over Anapji Pond, she felt a connection that transcended the present. He proposed a week later, standing among the tombs at twilight, and he presented her with an antique ring, silver, with an intricate design that looked impossibly old. He explained that it had been in his family for generations, passed down through lines of scholars and nobles, and that giving it to her meant binding their lives together in a tradition that honored the past. Sumin was overwhelmed by the romance of it, and she said yes, her heart full of a happiness she had not anticipated. Sang-woo insisted on a traditional wedding, conducted at night in accordance with old customs he said were specific to his family's lineage. He explained that such ceremonies were rare now, preserved only by those who valued historical authenticity, and that it would take place in a private area near the tombs, a location that had been used for such purposes centuries ago. Sumin found the idea unusual but thrilling, another unique experience to share with her followers, and she agreed without hesitation. The ceremony took place 3 days later, just after midnight, in a clearing surrounded by ancient burial mounds. The location was accessible only by a narrow path that wound through dense trees, and when they arrived, lanterns had been lit, casting flickering shadows across the grass. An elderly man in traditional robes waited for them, his face obscured by the dim light, and he conducted the ceremony in archaic Korean that Sumin barely understood. Sang-woo translated key phrases, guiding her through the vows, and when they exchanged rings and bowed to the earth as instructed, she felt a strange weight settle over her, as if the ground itself had acknowledged their union. The ceremony ended abruptly, the old man disappearing into the darkness, and Sang-woo led her back to the guest house where they were staying, his hand cold in hers. The strangeness began immediately. That first night, Sumin woke several times to find Sang-woo sitting by the window, staring out at the tombs visible in the distance, his posture rigid and unmoving. When she asked if he was all right, he turned to her with that unblinking gaze and said he was simply thinking about their future, about the life they would build together. She noticed then that his clothes, the traditional hanbok he had worn for the ceremony, were stained with mud at the hems and cuffs, dark and caked, as if he had been kneeling in wet earth. She asked him about it, and he claimed he must have brushed against the ground during the ceremony, though she could not recall any moment when that would have happened. The next morning she tried to wash the garments, but the mud would not come out, clinging to the fabric with a stubbornness that seemed unnatural. Sang-woo dismissed her concerns, saying the stains did not matter, and he changed into modern clothes, though the mud seemed to follow him, appearing on his shoes, his hands. Even on the sheets where Saturday Sumin began to feel uneasy, a creeping sense that something about her husband had changed since the wedding, or perhaps that something had been revealed. She started noticing other details that disturbed her. Sang-woo never blinked, his eyes remaining open and fixed even during long conversations, and when she pointed it out, he laughed and said she was imagining things, though he did not demonstrate by blinking. He stopped eating, claiming his stomach was unsettled, and she never saw him drink water or consume anything, his meals left untouched. His skin grew paler, taking on a grayish tone that reminded her of stone weathered by centuries, and when she touched him, he was always cold, far colder than the autumn air warranted. He also began speaking in ways that felt anachronistic, using phrases and references that seemed out of place, as if he were drawing from a vocabulary rooted in a different era. When she questioned him, he deflected, saying he spent so much time immersed in historical texts that the language sometimes bled into his speech. But the explanations felt hollow, and Sumin's unease grew into fear. She decided to research him, searching online for any mention of a historian named Kang Sang-woo, but she found nothing. No academic papers, no university affiliations, no digital footprint at all. It was as if he did not exist outside of the weeks they had spent together. Desperate for answers, Sumin went to the Gyeongju National Museum and asked to speak with someone in the historical research department. A young curator listened to her description of Sang-woo and his work, and after some hesitation, she led Sumin to a back office where older records were kept. She pulled out a ledger, a collection of genealogies and noble family trees from the Silla period, and asked Sumin to describe the ring Sang-woo had given her. Sumin showed her the ring, still on her finger, and the curator's face went pale. She pointed to an entry in the ledger, a name written in classical Chinese characters, translating to Kang Sang-woo, a minor nobleman who had lived over 1,000 years ago. According to the records, he had died unmarried at the age of 30, his grave located in an unmarked mound on the eastern edge of Daryeongwan. The curator explained that such individuals, dying without heirs or proper ceremony, were often believed to linger as restless spirits, and that folklore from the region spoke of ghosts who sought to complete in death what they could not in life. Sumin listened in horror, her hands trembling, and she asked if there was any way to verify this. The curator suggested visiting the tomb listed in the records, though she warned that the site was not maintained and was considered unsafe. Sumin went to the location that afternoon, her heart pounding with dread. The tomb was small and overgrown, hidden behind newer mounds, and accessible only by pushing through thick underbrush. When she reached it, she found the earth disturbed, as if something had recently emerged from within. There were footprints in the mud, leading away from the tomb and toward the path she had taken, and the prints matched the shoes Sang-woo had been wearing. She knelt beside the disturbed earth, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and she saw fragments of old pottery and bone partially exposed, relics that should have remained buried. She realized with absolute certainty that her husband was not alive, that he had been dead for a millennium, and that the wedding ceremony had been a binding that pulled him from his grave into a mockery of life. She ran from the site, her mind fracturing, and she returned to the guest house, determined to confront him. But when she arrived, Sang-woo was waiting, his expression calm and knowing, and he asked her if she had enjoyed her visit to his resting place. She demanded to know what he was, her voice shaking with rage and terror, and he told her the truth without hesitation. He had been a nobleman of minor rank, educated and well-regarded, but he had died young and unmarried, a fate considered deeply unfortunate in his time. His spirit had remained bound to the tomb, unable to move on because he had not fulfilled the social obligations expected of him, and for over 1,000 years he had lingered, watching the world change, forgotten and alone. When Sumin arrived in Gyeongju, her presence had stirred something in him, a hope that perhaps he could finally complete what had been left undone. The wedding, conducted in the old ways and on sacred ground, had given him the anchor he needed to manifest fully, to take form and walk among the living once more. He loved her, he claimed, as much as something like him could love, and he wanted her to stay, to remain his wife in the way his culture had demanded. But the bond they had formed was not one-sided, he explained, and now she was tied to him, to his tomb, to the earth that had held him for so long. She was his bride, and in the traditions of his time, a bride belonged to her husband's family, even in death. Sumin screamed at him, calling him a monster, and she tried to flee the room. But when she reached the door, she found it would not open, the handle cold and immovable, and the windows were sealed shut, frost spreading across the glass despite the mild weather. Sang-woo stood slowly, his movements too smooth, and he told her there was no escape, that she had agreed to this when she accepted his ring and spoke the vows. She tore the ring from her finger and threw it at him, but it clattered to the floor and rolled back to her feet, as if drawn by an invisible force. He told her the ring was a symbol of their bond, and that removing it changed nothing. The contract had been made and witnessed by powers older than either of them. He extended his hand toward her, his skin gray and cold, and he asked her to return with him, to come to the tomb where they could rest together, where she would no longer feel the confusion and fear of the living world. She backed away, her mind searching desperately for a way out, and she grabbed her phone, trying to call for help. But the screen was frozen, the device dead despite having been fully charged, and she realized that the technology of the present held no power here, in this space where the past had bled through. That night, Sumin did not sleep. She barricaded herself in the bathroom, the only room with a lock that still worked, and she tried to think through her options. She could not call for help, could not leave the building, and Sang-woo waited patiently outside the door, occasionally speaking to her in soft, coaxing tones, telling her that resistance was futile and that acceptance would bring peace. As dawn approached, she heard other sounds, footsteps in the hallway that did not belong to Sang-woo, heavy and rhythmic, like soldiers marching in formation. She opened the door a crack and saw them, figures in ancient armor, translucent and flickering like old film, their faces blank and expressionless. They lined the hallway, blocking any path of escape, and Sang-woo stood among them, his hands still extended, his eyes unblinking and patient. He told her these were the guards of his family's tomb, spirits bound to protect and serve, and that they had come to escort her home. Sumin realized then that she had no options left, that the world she had known was closed to her now, and that the only path forward was into the earth, into the darkness that Sang-woo called home. She made one final attempt to reason with him, asking if there was any way to undo the marriage, to release her from the bond. He considered this, his expression thoughtful, and he told her that the only way to dissolve such a union was for one party to willingly release the other, a gesture of love and sacrifice. But he would not do so, he said, because his loneliness had been too great, too long, and he could not bear to return to it. She begged him, tears streaming down her face, and he simply shook his head, his gaze filled with a sadness that transcended time. He told her that she would grow to accept this, that in the quiet of the tomb, freed from the noise and pain of living, she would find peace. He took her hand, his grip gentle but unyielding, and the ghostly soldiers parted, forming a corridor that led out of the guest house and toward the tombs. Sumin's legs moved without her willing them to, her body obeying a force she could not resist, and she walked beside her husband into the pre-dawn darkness. They reached the small, forgotten tomb as the sun began to rise, its light pale and cold, and Sang-woo guided her to the disturbed earth. He told her to lie down, to close her eyes, and to let the earth reclaim what it was owed. Sumin's mind screamed, but her body complied, sinking into the cold mud, and the last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Sang-woo's unblinking gaze. watching her with an expression that might have been love or might have been hunger. She could no longer tell the difference. When hikers found her 3 days later, she was half buried in the mud near an unmarked tomb, her body cold but alive, her eyes open and staring at nothing. She was taken to a hospital, treated for exposure and shock, but she did not speak, did not respond to questions or stimuli. The doctors could find no physical cause for her condition, and she was eventually transferred to a psychiatric facility where she remained, silent and unmoving, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. Her belongings were returned to her family, including an antique silver ring that no one could identify, and her blog went silent. The last post, a detailed description of a traditional night wedding in a burial ground. The photos showing her standing alone among the tombs, her arms positioned as if holding someone's hand, her smile directed at empty air. And on certain nights, when the moon was full and the wind carried whispers from the past, locals reported seeing 2 figures near the old tomb, walking hand in hand, one living and one dead, bound together in a marriage that neither time nor death could end. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And yet, as disturbing as that story was, there is one more tale to share. One final account of love, twisted into something unrecognizable. This last story takes us to the cold northern coast, to a city where the sea dominates everything, where fishermen risk their lives daily against the waves, and where the line between the living and the drowned is thinner than anywhere else. What happened here involves not just a ghost, but the ocean itself, that vast and hungry entity that claims lives without mercy and sometimes refuses to let them go. This is a story about what the sea takes and what it demands in return. The first time Yeon-hee touched his skin, she thought, he had been swimming in winter water. It was December, the coldest month in Sokcho, and her fiancé's skin was like ice, so cold it made her fingers ache when she held his hand. He apologized, saying the fishing boats were brutal this time of year, that the spray from the sea left him chilled to the bone, and she believed him because she wanted to, because everything else about him seemed perfect. His name was Dae-jung, and he was a fisherman who worked the waters off the eastern coast, bringing in squid and mackerel to sell at the city's bustling seafood markets. They had met in late autumn at a small restaurant near the harbor where Yeon-hee worked as a waitress, and he had become a regular, always arriving just after sunset, always ordering the same simple meal. He was quiet and polite, with a weathered face that spoke of years spent facing the elements, and when he finally asked her to have coffee with him after her shift, she agreed, charmed by his gentle persistence. Yeon-hee was 32, a widow who had lost her first husband to illness 3 years prior, and she had not expected to fall in love again. But Dae-jung made it easy, his presence steady and undemanding, his affection expressed through small gestures rather than grand declarations. He brought her fresh fish from his catches, helped repair things in her small apartment, and listened when she talked about her grief and her fears. Within 2 months, he proposed, and she accepted, grateful for the second chance at happiness. They planned a modest wedding for the spring, and Dae-jung moved into her apartment, though she quickly noticed he had peculiar habits. He refused to sleep indoors, insisting the air was too stifling, and he set up a makeshift bed on her balcony despite the freezing temperatures. He claimed it reminded him of the boat, that he slept better with the sound of the sea nearby, and Yeon-hee, wanting to accommodate him, did not press the issue. He also refused to join her for meals, saying his appetite was poor and that he ate at odd hours, and she never saw him consume more than a few bites of anything. His clothes always smelled of salt and brine, even when freshly washed, and his hair was perpetually damp, as if he had just emerged from the water. The oddities piled up, but Yeon-hee attributed them to the hardships of his profession, to the toll that life at sea took on a man's body and habits. She loved him, or at least she loved the stability he represented, and she was willing to overlook the strangeness. But as winter deepened, the cold that clung to him became unbearable. When they embraced, it was like holding a block of ice, and she began wearing layers even indoors to ward off the chill that radiated from him. She mentioned it multiple times, suggesting he see a doctor, but he dismissed her concerns with a sad smile, saying he had always run cold, that it was simply his nature. She also noticed that he avoided mirrors, turning his face away whenever they passed one, and that photographs of him came out blurred or distorted, his features obscured, as if the camera could not properly capture him. When she asked about his family, hoping to meet them before the wedding, he became evasive, saying they were estranged and that he preferred not to discuss them. She found this troubling but did not push, respecting what she assumed was a painful past. The truth began to unravel during a particularly violent winter storm. Yeon-hee had been at work when the weather turned, the sky darkening to an unnatural black and the wind howling with a ferocity that rattled the restaurant's windows. The owner closed early, sending everyone home, and Yeon-hee rushed back to her apartment, worried about Dae-jung sleeping on the balcony in such conditions. When she arrived, the balcony door was open, rain pouring inside, and Dae-jung was standing at the railing, staring out at the churning sea, his clothes soaked and his hair plastered to his skull. She called to him, but he did not respond, his gaze fixed on the waves as if mesmerized. She approached carefully, the wind nearly knocking her off her feet, and she touched his shoulder. He turned slowly, and for a moment his face was not his own, the features slack and waterlogged, his eyes black and empty like deep ocean trenches. She stumbled back, gasping, and he blinked, his face returning to normal, and he asked her what was wrong. She could not articulate it. The vision had been so brief, but the image was seared into her mind, and she demanded to know what was happening, why he looked like that. Dae-jung did not answer immediately. He stepped inside, closing the balcony door against the storm, and he sat on the floor, his wet clothes pooling water around him. He told her, in a voice barely audible over the wind, that he had not been entirely honest with her, that there were things about him she did not know. Yeon-hee's heart pounded, and she demanded the full truth, her voice shaking with fear and anger. He looked at her with an expression of profound sorrow, and he explained that he had died 2 years ago, his fishing boat capsizing during a winter squall much like the one raging outside. The waves had been merciless, dragging him and his crew down into the freezing water, and he had drowned, his body lost to the sea. He did not know why he had returned, why his spirit had washed ashore instead of dissipating into the depths, but he had found himself walking the docks one evening, solid and seemingly alive, and the hunger to reclaim what he had lost had driven him forward. When he met Yeon-hee, he had seen a chance to live again, to experience warmth and companionship, and he had taken it without considering the consequences. He loved her, he insisted, as much as something like him could love, but he was not alive, and the ocean that had taken him still called to him, still claimed him as its own. Yeon-hee listened in horror, her mind rejecting the words even as they made terrible sense. She thought about the cold, the refusal to eat or sleep indoors, the way he always smelled of the sea, and she realized she had been living with a ghost, sharing her life with something that should have remained drowned. She demanded to know why he had deceived her, why he had let her fall in love with a lie, and he told her he had been selfish, that the loneliness of death was unbearable, and that she had offered him an escape. But the ocean was patient and possessive, he said, and it was beginning to reclaim him, pulling him back toward the water, and soon he would not be able to resist. He warned her that being near him was dangerous, that the sea's hunger extended to those he cared about, and that she needed to distance herself before it was too late. Yan-hee wanted to run, to leave, and never look back, but she also felt a twisted pity for him, for the man she had loved who was trapped between worlds. She asked if there was a way to free him, to let him rest, and he shook his head, saying the ocean did not release what it had claimed, and that his only peace would come when he returned to the depths. The storm raged for 3 days, and during that time, Dae-jung grew weaker, his form becoming more translucent, his skin taking on a bluish tint that resembled drowning. He stopped speaking, his eyes fixed on the sea visible from the balcony, and Yan-hee watched him fade, unsure of what to do. On the 3rd night, she woke to find the apartment flooded, seawater pouring in through cracks in the walls and floor, rising rapidly despite being on the 4th floor of the building. She screamed, trying to reach the door, but the water was already waist-deep and rising, ice-cold and filled with the smell of brine and death. Dae-jung was standing in the center of the room, submerged to his chest, and he told her in a voice like waves crashing that the ocean had come for him, and that it wanted her as well. She had become part of his world by loving him, by accepting him into her life, and the sea considered her a debt to be collected. She tried to fight the water, to swim toward the door, but invisible currents pulled at her, dragging her down, and she felt hands, cold and slick, grasping at her ankles and wrists. Dae-jung reached for her, his expression anguished, and he told her he was sorry, that he had not meant for this to happen, but that the ocean's will was absolute. He offered her a choice, to come with him willingly, to let the water take her and join him in the depths where they could be together in a way the living world did not allow, or to fight and drown alone. Her body lost like his had been. Yeon-hee, her lungs burning, her vision blurring, chose to fight. She kicked and clawed her way toward the surface, breaking free of the grasping hands. And she reached the door, wrenching it open and stumbling into the hallway. The water did not follow, stopping at the threshold as if held back by an invisible barrier, and she collapsed on the dry floor, coughing and gasping. When she looked back, the apartment was empty, the water gone. Dae-jung vanished, and everything was as it had been before the storm. She lay there for hours, shivering and sobbing, until neighbors found her and called for help. Yeon-hee was taken to the hospital, treated for shock and mild hypothermia, though the doctors could not explain how she had gotten so cold in her own apartment. She told them about the flooding, but when authorities checked the building, there was no water damage, no sign of any intrusion. They attributed her account to trauma or hallucination, and after a few days she was released with recommendations for psychiatric care. She moved out of the apartment immediately, finding a new place inland, far from the sea, but the ocean's presence followed her. At night, she heard waves crashing outside her window, even though the coast was miles away, and she woke to find her floors damp with salt water that evaporated by morning. She tried to build a new life, to forget Dae-jung and the nightmare he had brought into her world, but the cold remained, a persistent chill in her bones that no amount of heat could dispel. And on the anniversary of the storm, she woke to find him standing at the foot of her bed, his form translucent and dripping, his eyes sad and hollow, whispering that the ocean had taken him and that it wanted her too, that their bond was not finished, that she belonged to the depths now whether she accepted it or not. She learned to live with the visitations, the nightly appearances that lasted only moments before he faded, the cold that never left, the way the sea seemed to follow her no matter how far inland she went. She stopped trying to explain it to others, knowing they would not believe her, and she resigned herself to a life haunted by the man she had loved and the ocean that claimed him. Some nights, standing at her window and staring at the distant horizon, she wondered if it would be easier to simply go to the coast, to walk into the waves and let them take her, to stop fighting and accept the fate Dae-jung had warned her about. But she resisted, clinging to the warmth of the living world even as it grew dimmer, even as the cold closed in, because she knew that once the ocean took her, there would be no coming back, no escape from the depths where Dae-jung waited, where the drowned linger forever, calling to those they loved, asking them to join the endless, freezing dark. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.